Orson Welles made 39 episodes of The Lives of Harry Lime for radio in 1951. These are flashbacks remembered by a person now dead. Many shows have flashbacks, sometimes the whole movie, remembered by a person just about to die or by a ghost, or by the decaying brain of a dead person, as in Orson Welles' radio production of The Brain That Wouldn't Die. The preview for Oliver Stone's Savages has a woman's voiceover saying, "Just because I'm telling you the story doesn't mean I'm alive at the end of it." Flashbacks are more than prequels. They entangle secondary temporal sequences into a film's succession of present moments. Some flashbacks occur in a continuous block, like Harry Lime's. Some are dispersed in between presents, but they reproduce the past's original order. Some flashbacks are out of order. It's anything the director wants. There are going to be 4 sections of this paper: a section on flashbacks, a section on depth of field, back to flashbacks, and then radio. Deleuze argues that the flashbacks in Citizen Kane are the world's first sheets of past, the first cinematic, pure past, direct time images. So one way to define a pure past direct time image is that it's an image of time that's independent of action, where the past is not merely a former present, but where the whole past coexists contemporaneously with the present. So it's detached from action and the whole past simultaneous with the present. So I have to assume that you all know Citizen Kane by heart in order to give this paper. Just to remind you, in the first scene, Kane dies. His last word is Rosebud. What does it mean? A reporter hopes to find Rosebud on one of the sheets of Kane's past, as Deleuze puts it. The reporter gets Kane's acquaintances, who are now old, to remember what they can. Most of the flashbacks just begin when the reporter asks a question. It's as obvious as a ripple fade introducing a memory. The character Thatcher's flashback, slightly different, begins with a written journal. The opening newsreel is a kind of montage flashback, an index for the later flashbacks. Other directors have trickier ways of introducing flashbacks, but Deleuze has a taste for straightforward chaos rather than gimmicky chaos. Deleuze discusses many kinds of flashbacks: Carnet's destiny-oriented flashbacks, Mankiewicz's forking path or multiple personality flashbacks. Deleuze contrasts Rachamon's unreliable flashbacks. The memories in Citizen Kane are inconclusive, but they're usually reliable, and contrasts these with the time machine flashbacks in René's Je t'aime, je t'aime. We sometimes neglect one of Deleuze's favorite images of thought, the numbered list. Deleuze has a lot of numbered lists. Everybody knows he has 6 principles of the rhizome. In the cinema books, he has 3 avatars of the movement image, 4 aspects of the impulse image, 5 laws of the action image. So I'm going to count at least 10 more types of flashbacks. 1, reparation flashbacks, as in source code. 2, flash laterals that are more like daydreams. 3, flash forwards that turn out only to have been dreams, like season 8 of Dallas. 4, flashbacks that enter the past through Madeleine's postcards, paintings, or scenes from old films. 5, time travel recursions, where the character leaves multiple versions of himself behind, as in Time Crimes. 6, flashbacks to past lives, whether one's own life or someone else's, as in Dead Again. 7, flashbacks narrated by children and liars. 8, flashbacks where the character tries to remember something but gets only a blank screen, as in Arrested Development's footage not found gag. 9, flashbacks to implanted memories, as in Total Recall. 10, flashbacks merely by suggestion, where all we see is a present gesture, but it intimates a flashback. It's as if we see a flashback. Plus, there are parodies of each kind. There are films where we don't know if we're seeing flashbacks or not, as with Ruiz or Lynch. I don't know if there are films yet where an animal or a computer has a flashback, or when 2 characters co-author a flashback. Deleuze raises the paradox of what he calls a memory for 2 people, but his case, last year at Marienbad, has 2 characters compete for flashback rights, which is not quite the same as co-authoring a flashback. Maybe a better example of that would be Wayne's World. Someday, nano cameras will pull flashbacks out of our own brains, as Johnny Mnemonic predicts. And there are implicit flashbacks in amnesia and identity theft films, Twins Separated at Birth films, historical dramas with long, long ago preludes, and Last Day of the World films, and probably lots of others. Of course, temporal entanglement is found not only in cinema, but also in living memory. It's a structure of time itself. So the cinematic sheets of past are really a variation on Deleuze's ontological theory of the pure past from Difference and Repetition in other texts. Now there's a methodological problem here. If sheets of past, that is the coexistence of past and present independent of action sequences, can be proved to exist by ontological analysis, does that mean that their cinematic instances are merely secondary? Conversely, if sheets of past exist first and foremost in cinema, does that prove that they really exist in real time? How can we use a work of art to discuss a philosophical concept? A work of art could say that times overlap, even if times cannot overlap, just as a fiction can say that fascism is good when it's not good. Deleuze usually suggests that he thinks there really are sheets of past in the real world. He says we find them in life whenever we follow two paths of action at once. We might one day find them in faster-than-light physics, he suggests. But at other times, Deleuze suggests that sheets of past are specifically cinematic, that film is what makes directly visible relations of time, that are not, where time is not directly visible in life, but seen only through action. Now, sometimes when Deleuze talks of a direct image, he means something straightforward. Talkies made sound direct, whereas silent film showed sound only indirectly through intertitles and other means. However, the idea of a direct image is a tricky point for Deleuze, who says, an image is not just given to be seen, it is legible as well as visible. An image is not just what is in a frame. The image includes what's outside and sutured to the frame, what's before, after, and read into the frame. It's similar to Godard's theory of image. So when Deleuze says that the time image is direct, time might be a direct image, but not immediately visible. The directness of the image may not mean immediately visible. Well, in contrast, action is, for Deleuze, straightforwardly visible. In action movies, each image expands the present organically into a large circuit. In cases where the action of a movie rotates around a single image, it makes a short circuit, and that's what we call a flashback. Kane's death, the beginning of Citizen Kane, is such an image, a single image, and the rest of the film flashes back from it. If several series flash back to the same point, they're like aspects of a crystal, he says, or films within a film. Still an action image, but a looping action image. Normally, flashbacks are rearranged action images. But Deleuze argues that flashbacks can do more than add scenes about the past to scenes about the present. Flashbacks, or something like it, can also make the past survive into the present, and hence can split one event into two times that exist at once, simultaneously presenting the passing present and one or more pasts. When they do this, Deleuze calls them not flashbacks, but sheets of past. Do sheets of past exist? It sounds funny to ask this, as if it's a matter of descriptions corresponding to the facts, but Deleuze says he's not interested in metaphors. He's interested in encounters between language and reality. And in any case, Deleuze says exactly this. The sheets of past exist. He says, les nappes de passé existent. Nappe de passé. As a metaphor, sheets suggest layers or strata or regions. In the Geology of Morals plateau, Deleuze speaks of couche or strate, sometimes région. The sheets of past suggest planes on Bergson's memory cone. If you know the Bergson's image of a memory cone, memory is like a cone where there are kind of horizontal lines that represent different points of the past. Bergson calls the planes on the memory cone plan, but that would be confusing here because in cinema, plan in French means shot. So Deleuze chose the word nappe for sheet here, and literally a nappe is a sheet of water or a tablecloth. So that's the term for sheets of past. Deleuze's ontological thesis is that the pure past exists independently of the passing present. So here's another possible definition of the pure past. The pure past is the virtual repeatability of an event, the event's rememberability. And an event has this property of being rememberable at the same time as it passes in the present. In this way, the pastness of the event coexists temporally with the present, but in a different kind of temporal order. For Deleuze, present and past are not two moments in time, but two kinds of time. So at any given moment, there are two temporalities in progress, not one. And in theory, cinema flashbacks show this. Now, I believe that Deleuze's arguments in Difference and Repetition for the existence of the pure past are his very best creations. There are difficulties with those arguments that Deleuze studies has yet to solve, but for this paper, I'm just going to assume that these arguments work and that the theory of the pure past is a good idea. Now, of course, film presents images in succession, and this creates tricky problems for the theory of cinematic sheets of past. In flashbacks, even if there are sheets of coexisting past, they still have to be presented in succession. The image of coexisting time has to appear sequentially in the medium of film. The best film can do, it seems, is to resequence events and thereby force the pasts to coexist in spite of the intervals between them and within them. Time would be made pure by undoing the succession that we find in events. This is kind of funny because it means that for Deleuze, pure time undoes what we usually call time, which is succession. And as we're going to see, Deleuze's time image of the past is not exactly past, it's not exactly time, not exactly an image. Well, Deleuze ties sheets of past to three on-screen paradigms. So first, there are stages of a character's narrative. You could call those sheets of past. Each narrative is on screen at a different time, but if they're cut discontinuously, their order of succession can become irrelevant, so they all pertain at once. That's one paradigm. Second, sheets of past could be the parallel narratives told from different characters' points of view, like the flashbacks in Citizen Kane. It's a different paradigm. And a third paradigm, in a deep focus image, there are different planes of depth on view at the same time, each of which could represent a different time period. So these three paradigms for how sheets of past should look in a film, stages of character development, perspectives of narratives, and planes of depth, they're very different from each other. But they all allow Deleuze to say in one way or another that we jump from one sheet of past to another in the course of a film, or all at once. It's difficult to specify the exact limit of a particular sheet of past, that is, when a time frame or a point of view or a depth of focus begins and ends, but that's okay. Now, the section of Cinema 2, Deleuze's text, Cinema 2, that deals with sheets of past, focuses on Orson Welles' cinema, and it's 11 pages long. How many of you have read it? The first 2 pages distinguish sheets of past from standard action flashbacks. 4 pages deal with depth of field, and the last 5 follow Welles's development from film to film, which I'll just summarize briefly when we get to it. Now, sheets of past are chronosigns, time signs, and Deleuze contrasts them with another species of direct time image, peaks of present. I'm not going to say much about this, although it occupies Deleuze for a couple of pages. It's quite important in the text. And so for those of you who remember it or want a hint, it's one of the pages of the handout. So I just listed different features of peaks of present and sheets of past, but I'm not really going to talk about them. I'm just going to say one thing about what the difference is. Peaks of present are at play if the same event is presented at different times. For example, if the same childhood event is shown at different times of the film. So it's one form of coexistence of time, peaks of the present. They're like the present peaks at different moments. The scenes arise in succession, but because their contents cover the same diegetical time frame, they cover the same period of time, the scenes pull us into a simultaneous time. In contrast, sheets of past, which I am going to talk about, are at play if different events are presented at the same time. For example, if a character's childhood and adulthood are shown somehow in the same shot. There's 2 different diegetical pieces of time, but shown at the same time or experienced at the same time. It's possible that Deleuze could be right about sheets of past, but not about peaks of present, or vice versa. A Freudian might agree that traumatic repetition generates peaks of present, but not agree that sheets of past could all be present at once. Conversely, a Hegelian could agree to sheets of past, that is, history is recapitulated, but not agree that the same present could be relived. That's all I'm going to say about that contrast. A sheet of past contains an event, an explorable region of history, which contains internal sequences of past, present, and future. So a sheet of past is not an instant, it's a period of the past. The sheet of past is a film within a film. It will take time to look through the sheet of past, although it may be there just for a moment. This is a tricky point. The sheet of past appears both as a single moment and as a sequence, both as a slice and a continuum. Deleuze says both. It's both the part and the whole. When we talk about the sheet of past as a continuum, that suggests flashback. The sheet of past as a slice of time suggests a composition. where you might see the past in the background, perhaps embodied in a toy from the character's youth. As we said, Deleuze reserves the term flashback for mere chronological fillers, and he uses the term sheets of past for coexistent effects. However, Deleuze allows that classical flashbacks too confuse the past and present, and in fact the distinction is not that easy to maintain. So if you look at the literature on Citizen Kane, which is enormous, some commentators, film theorists on Citizen Kane, happily use the term flashback to explore the same kind of tangled time structures that Deleuze insists should not be called flashbacks. So Andrew Serra says, for example, time is thrown back and brought forward in the 4 flashbacks of Citizen Kane. Peter Wolin uses the term flashback to say that the final tracking shot over the accumulation of objects in the Great Hall of Xanadu, if you remember that scene, over the residue of different periods of Kane's life, presents Kane's life in inverse order, as we're looking through the stuff that he had in his castle when he died. Now, speaking of inverse order, Deleuze does not emphasize inverse order, but it is a relevant possibility. In Back from the Future films, like René Clair's It Happened Tomorrow, the future has already happened in the story, and the past is what we're seeing now as the film goes by. The past here is really treated more like the present than like a former present. And since the past contains options that are not limited by the present, so we don't know what's going to happen, the past is in some ways most like the future, because we don't know what's going to happen in it. Combining past, present, and future in one movie is the Christmas Carol gimmick. Strictly speaking, backward-running films, like Memento, order the scenes in reverse, but each scene proceeds forwards. Otherwise, the dialogue would be garbled. In fact, frame-by-frame reversal would produce slapstick. Memento puts the main narrative in backwards order, but if you remember, it intersperses the secondary semi-Jankus scenes, the scenes in black and white. Those are in forwards order as they're presented in the film. In fact, it doesn't really make sense that Memento's protagonist, who lacks short-term memory, should experience a series of recent pasts at all. In any case, the disadvantage in time reversal is that showing a scene from the past after a scene from the present necessarily explains the present, even if it's a little confusing. That's why time reversal is not an ideal form for sheets of past. Reversing the time order makes events fit into their rightful place. Backwards time is common sense. The crazy thing about time is when it moves forwards, when what happens next is a future which doesn't even exist. In short, the past becomes pure when it has not already taken place, but takes a line of flight through the labyrinth of the straight line forward. Does this mean that the pure time image should really show just the blank screen of the future? Occasionally, Deleuze favors blank screen cinema, like Michael Snow's experiments, but usually not, and usually there's something on screen, and it's the past in the present that has to function as the future. Well, as we were saying, some commentators on Citizen Kane preserve the term flashback to discuss temporal entanglements. Others interpret flashbacks to be not about time at all, but to be about doubles. So Laura Mulvey is a famous feminist film theorist. Her interpretation is that 2 psychoanalytic motifs divide the plot of Citizen Kane. The first, male-dominated section of the film tells the story of the Oedipal Kane battling against his surrogate father, and the second, Susan-dominated section shows Kane fetishistically amassing things, attempting to fill the void of his separation from his mother. Deleuze is all for psychic doubling, but for him, the doubling of childhood and adulthood is a synthesis of time, whereas for Mulvey, doubles are held in the timelessness of the unconscious. So I'm not going to solve this now, but assuming as I do that Deleuze is right, that the embedded narratives in Citizen Kane are about time and are not traditional flashbacks, in what sense are these narratives images? Deleuze needs to pinpoint the techniques whereby the medium of cinema makes time visible. So this is going to lead to the second section now, depth of field. Depth of field is a cinematic technique to make sheets of past visible. Some of Wells's techniques for temporal resequencing are classical: extra slow crossfades, overlapping dialogue, and forms of montage. But Wells's innovation in generating sheets of past is depth of field. Depth of field, that is where I'll define this a bit later, where the focus is sharp from the foreground to the background of the composition. Depth of field combined with long-duration sequence shots, so what are sometimes called tracking or traveling or moving camera shots, long-duration shots with few cuts, André Bazin, maybe the most famous film theorist, certainly influenced on Deleuze, thinks that this combination, depth of field and long-duration sequence shots, democratically gives the viewer time and depth to explore events. Wells endorsed Bazin's thesis, although later Wells wondered whether it hadn't been a little bit pompous on his part. Wells, in interviews, downplays what Wells calls the use of time and all that, or the overlapping thing. Deleuze agrees that depth of field is tied to long-duration sequence shots. It sounds funny to say that the contraction of time into a single frame in deep focus has to be carried out by long shots. It's as if a still photograph in deep focus moved like the paintings in Harry Potter, or as if a continuous shot expresses time without succession. Seems funny to link spatial depth at all with temporal duration. But Bazin's idea is that as long as there's no cut, a character can walk through the set diagonally, side to side, back to front, all the way through the shot, covering three-dimensional coordinates throughout the frame, and it's the deep focus photography that tracks the movement. So there's something plausible about that. So to imagine an artificial example, if a character is looking for his wallet and walks toward the background and finds the wallet in the pants he must have put in the closet last night, you could say the camera has found the past in depth of field. Now, clearly, almost every point in the relation between deep focus and the presentation of the past admits exceptions. First, deep focus is surely not necessary to express sheets of past. Deleuze admits that sometimes, if you could find the past in the depth of the shot, sometimes you could find it laterally. That lateral differences across the screen could refer to different points in the past. And second, deep focus is surely not sufficient to produce reference to the past. And third, long-duration shots are not necessary for sheets of past. Cut-up shots could entangle time as well. And fourth, long-duration shots are not necessary for depth of field. Some long-duration shots, ultra-long shots, do explore depth of field. Russian Arc does, but the Werkmeister Harmonies does not. Anyway, as Deleuze said that sheets of past should jump across times, it's not obvious why they would have to jump in continuous shots. In general, how do we verify when we look at a shot whether depth is making a sheet of past? In fact, Deleuze says only a certain type of depth on screen has temporal force. When deep focus contains merely parallel planes of depth, what Deleuze calls depth in field, that need not express any temporal relation, just because there's different planes of depth. Only when the characters move or address one another across the planes of depth, which Deleuze calls depth of field, only then does depth imply a temporal difference. It's the movement that makes the two phases of time coexist. In the wallet scenario I told, the background becomes the foreground's flashback. Deleuze says that if a scene is about to force a character to have a memory, then that scene justifies the use of deep focus, as when the deep tracking shot zeroes in on Susan to force her memory, if you can remember when Susan is first forced to give her flashback story. Well, just as a certain theory demands that music in a scene be justified by the presence of an orchestra or radio visible in the shot, so perhaps we should only see the back of the set if the story is about to flash back to a memory. In Deleuze's first example of depth and time, it's less a matter of bringing two times together as of coordinating elements into the field of a single event. So his first example is when, if you remember this, when Kane is in the newspaper office, he walks forward to address Leland, who's in another plane of depth. Kane moves through the planes of depth, creating violent foreshortening perspectives along the way. And when Kane arrives at Leland's plane of depth, they meet in a slice of time. And Deleuze says their friendship breaks exactly then and there. The place where they meet is stretched into a sheet of time at which the action pauses and events for a moment coexist. To make this sort of thing visually explicit, think of the original Thomas Crown affair, where the action is taking place on screen, the action freezes for a minute, then that frame is shrunk into a particular spot on the screen, into a frame within a frame, so that the frozen sheet of past occupies a particular spot on screen simultaneous with the rest of the screen, which is in the present, which carries on. So, okay, you figure that out. But if the storyboard in Citizen Kane had called for Kane to take a few extra steps so he didn't stop exactly on the plane of depth where Leland was, then obviously this wouldn't have occurred here. The friendship would have been broken, And there would still be a sheet of coexisting time at the moment when events coalesce, but it would be unrelated to depth. Deleuze's second example of depth and time is when Kane, at the end, walks through the objects that he had accumulated in Xanadu. It was not quite at the end, but when he's walking through the objects he's accumulated. Deleuze says this: images in depth express regions of past, each with its own accents or potentials, and each one marks critical moments in Kane's will to power. The hero acts, walks, and moves, but it is in the past that he plunges himself into and moves in. And that sounds right in general. However, since we don't know the date of Kane's various purchases, the planes of depth do not exactly mark sheets of past, as Deleuze says, each with its own distinct potentials. Now, I've taken Deleuze very literally when he connects depth of field with sheets of past. Sometimes Deleuze is comically literal about his choice of terms. When he's discussing the small figure of action image, small action could include documentary films or melodramas rather than adventure movies, which are big action. When Deleuze introduces the term a small figure of action, he cites as an example Herzog's film Even Dwarves Started Small. However, it's not literally the case that different planes of depth always represent different time periods. So he can't mean this quite literally. Perhaps it's enough for Deleuze's point that the characters and audience members jump or glance from one time to another. Figuratively, different characters meet while at different stages in their lives. So in that sense, sheets of time communicate on screen. Deleuze's overall point might be plausible, even if we take depth figuratively. Indeed, Deleuze wants the uncertainty about when and where the past occurs. Deleuze likes to say we're looking, in the film, we're looking for the sheet of past with Rosebud on it, but that's not quite right. All Rosebud is going to tell us, when we find out what it is that Kane lost his mom, and we and all the characters already knew that. Old-fashioned flashbacks may locate where past events occurred, but sheets of time are supposed to make events temporally mobile. We don't need a unique plane of depth to represent a unique sheet of past. However, if nothing is at stake in whether there is past in depth, then depth is really more about space than time and just not relevant to sheets of past. It may be, as Deleuze says, that Wells deforms space and time simultaneously, so we should not even distinguish depth and time at all. Still, what is depth? You might have noticed that Deleuze uses the term depth of field in an unusual way. In most film vocabularies, depth of field measures the extent of the distance from foreground to background where the focus remains sharp. In other words, you can talk about deep depth of field or shallow depth of field. For a given scene, the filmmaker may want the deep depth of field to carry deep into the background, or may want the focus to be shallow and the background or the foreground to be out of focus. All the options fall under the heading of depth of field normally. To get deep focus, use a wide-angle lens, that is a lens with a short focal length. You step the aperture down. As you narrow the aperture, you're going to need more ambient light. With deep depth of field, there will seem to be a lot of space between the background and the foreground, so a character moving toward the viewer will seem to cover a lot of ground and appear to be moving especially fast, and time will seem contracted because the person is moving so fast. For shallow depth of field, you do the reverse. And then movements perpendicular to the screen seem to cover less ground and to slow, and therefore time elongates. If you want the viewer to see that the focus stays sharp all the way from background to foreground, often you don't notice, but if you want the viewer to notice, have Kane throw his jacket from the background to the foreground during the office celebration scene. Now, deep focus was common in 1920s German expressionist film, as were Wells's other common techniques, high contrast shadows and unusual angles. In the 1930s, Hollywood wanted to distance itself from things Germanic. And coincidentally, with the advent of sound recording in the early 30s, the bright studio night lights that were needed to close the aperture to get deep focus were too noisy for the sound recording equipment. Hence, the soft focus glamour photography of Hollywood in those years, when depth of field persisted only in the horror genre, as in the movie Mad Love in 1935, which was photographed by Citizen Kane's photographer, Greg Toland. So he's one of the few people who still knew how to do depth of field. By 1940, the year of Citizen Kane, Manufacturers had figured out how to quiet the studio lights, and Toland had improvised new lenses, and so luckily deep focus became available again just when Wells wanted it. Now, Deleuze narrows the term depth of field to mean only deep and not shallow focus. But he sometimes broadens the term depth of field in a different way to include not just deep, sharp focus, but also the deep overflow of shadows. Sometimes that's what he means, whether they're in focus or not. Shadows that move from foreground to background. Although Deleuze states that he insists that regions of past are defined by optical aspects, sometimes he doesn't mean that. Sometimes he broadens the term depth of field beyond optics altogether to mean the overflow of one character's point of view onto another's. And when he associates depth of field, sometimes he does with diagonals. This makes it broader still, since film images, whether in focus or not, are almost universally diagonal, from the train at the La Ciotat station to every wagon train in the West. Deleuze's very best example of depth of field in relation to sheets of past is Susan's suicide attempt scene. It is in Citizen Kane. So this is what I'm going to show you, if it works. This is just about 1 minute long. Let's hope this works.
Yeah, Dr. Corey. Susan.
Which one do I turn on? Okay. I'll do it again in that. Kane enters from the back door in sharp focus. Susan lies in mid-shot. A bottle of poison is in close-up. Kane sees Susan in the foreground. His visual address, as he looks at her, contributes depth. Deleuze refers to visible ceilings that constrain space. This is a famous innovation of Wells, although the ceiling is not actually visible in that scene, I think. Deleuze sometimes went from memory. It's not a big deal. He can make mistakes. A backlight spills shadows across the planes. The dark foreground forces the viewer to look into the background. As one body overflows its plane, it enters the other's shadow pool. Deleuze calls this the freeing of depth. So here's what Deleuze says about this scene. Wells invents a depth of field along a diagonal or gap, crossing all planes, making elements of each interact with the rest, and in particular having the background in direct contact with the foreground, as in this suicide scene, where Kane bursts in through the door at the back, tiny, while Susan is dying in the shadow in mid-shot, and the large mirror is seen in close-up. Actually, it's the bottle that's seen in close-up. Deleuze concludes this. Wells's new depth directly forms a region of time, a region of past which is defined by optical aspects or elements borrowed from interacting planes. It is a set of non-localizable connections, always from one plane to another, which constitutes the region of past or the continuum of duration. So how well justified is the inference from this scene to the ontology of sheets of past? When Kane approaches from the back door, how can we tell whether he's coming from a life in the past or just coming from outdoors? Characters do cross planes of depth here, though they're not very non-localizable. Kane is not like the alien hiding in the plumbing. Kane is not literally in two places at once, and yet, in moving through pools of light, he is in a sense. Kane, as it were, closes in on the present. But any shot of movement expresses some temporal entanglement. Where do we look for pure sheets of past? Okay, let's watch it again. I'm going to start a few seconds earlier this time, if I can. Don't look. Close your eyes for a second while I find this scene. Okay.
I never wanted to in the first place.
You will continue with your singing, Susan. I don't propose to have myself made ridiculous.
You don't propose to have yourself made ridiculous. What about me? I'm the one who's got to do the singing. I'm the one that gets the raspberry. Why don't you let me alone?
My reason satisfy me, Susan. You seem unable to understand me. I will not tell them to you again. You will continue with your singing. Dear Dr. Corey. Susan.
Did you notice right after the door knocked, we saw Michael walk into that? Kane orders Susan to continue singing. A flash future montage of performances overlaps, first with a fade-over newspaper headlines and Kane's headshots, B, with the light bulb filament that wraps them up into one pool of shadow, and C, the continuous audio behind the discontinuous visuals. Well, perhaps thinking of these continuities, Deleuze says that Susan's accumulated efforts emerge into one scene in long shot. The succession of failed performances collapse simultaneously into one result, but every action sequence culminates. That can't exactly be the sheet of past. We could imagine symbolic sheets of past. If Kane had worn a youthful hat when he came through the door and it fell off, revealing a bald spot by the time he got to Susan, or if Kane wore a youthful grin and an old man's hat at the same time, those things are not the case here. In terms of character perspective, Kane enters still thinking that Susan will be his opera star, but he arrives in a foreground where that has already not been the case for some time. His movement through depth does, in this way, force two temporal expectations into confrontation. That's a disparity which in turn was prophesied in the past. But this interpretation that Kane was always destined to have his way blocked, that his future coexisted with his past to drive a march of time, is largely, I think, an action image explanation. As for the depth of field, as you saw, the foreground and background are in sharp focus, but the middle ground, where Susan is in soft focus. How is this optically possible? The answer is that this shot is not typical depth of field made by light and lenses. This is an in-camera matte shot. Robert Carringer, who explains scene by scene how Citizen Kane was made, says this. First, the foreground was lighted and focused and shot with the background dark. Then the foreground was darkened and the background lighted. The lens was refocused. The film was rewound in the camera, and the scene reshot and double exposed. But that doesn't really matter. Deleuze is less interested in technology than in aesthetic effect. However it's made, the scene is deep. But do I actually see sheets of past here? I don't wish to be the Luddite who gloats that he sees nothing in modern art, but I have to say it's not there. I could talk myself into seeing it. There are effects that are something like what sheets of past should be. I don't want to expect too much. Maybe sheets of past are more visible in other scenes or in other movies, but what a great theory, I'm not seeing them there. Except that there is that problem with what should be visible in a visual. Much of modern aesthetics, for example, hangs on whether Laocoon is in full screen. So the back of your handout sheet is the sculpture of Laocoon. Lessing says, when you look at this sculpture, that you don't see Laocoon, the priest of Apollo, in full screen. He's not in full screen, and he can't be, because sculpture, unlike poetry, can only present one moment of time. The sculptor cannot make that moment, the one moment he's got, be the moment when Laocoon is in full screen, because screams are ugly. So the sculptor presents the penultimate moment and relies on the viewer's tendency to narrate the rest of the scene to herself. So this is all part of the idea of sculpture, plastic arts presenting space, and literary arts presenting time. And so plastic arts can't present time, so they have to do it indirectly. When we look at Laocoon, do we see a full screen or not? Lessing says we don't, but Goethe says he does. This is crucial, since if we see him in full screen, it follows that there is no difference between the arts of space and time. So all of modern aesthetics really hangs on what do you see there. I think it's not clear what we actually see when we look at visual art. Indeed, when we look at the face of another person, it's not clear that we can judge what that means. For Merleau-Ponty, we are conscious of the consciousness of others not by observation, but by interaction, when the other pulls for or against us. But in film, we cannot interact with the characters in that way. The Kuleshov effect proves that a face shows nothing but what montage says it shows. The Kuleshov was an experiment in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. They showed the same neutral face, edited so that you would see the face and then see a shot of food. When people saw that, they thought the face was the face of a person who's very hungry. Then they would show a different audience the same face, followed by an image of a coffin of a child, and the audience members would say that face shows somebody with a great sorrow on their face. So a face shows only what montage says it shows. So should we expect to see a sheet of time or not? Is time visible and bendable in the medium of cinema, or is that just a manner of speaking? If sheets of past do appear directly on screen, how could we be in doubt? If they do not, well, are they in the viewer's imagination, or are they in the film, but at no time visible? Flashbacks again. Now, at a certain point in the text, Deleuze switches the definition of sheets of past away from optics towards an issue of narrative, namely the way a character evokes memory. I'm just going to talk about this for a couple of pages. The topic of memory brings us back to the topic of flashbacks, which optical depth did not seem to. And now that we return to the main plot, Deleuze distinguishes three problems in memory: how a character evokes memory, whether the memory can be accessed, and whether it can be used by the character in the present. The twist is that memory justifies the use of flashbacks, but it's the disturbance of memory that evokes pure time. There will never be perfect access to memory, or unique representation of the past, or verifiably faithful use of it, but different memories are fixed to the present to different degrees. In Citizen Kane, the fixed point of Kane's death is what provokes the sheets of past and organizes their intervals. The fixed point doesn't need to show a character's face trying to remember. A flashback cue might be a camera angle or a voiceover, what Deleuze calls a sound present or a radiophonic center. It can be any cue. And of course, in cinema, one could simply just splice together temporally distant events. But plot disorder does not always count as a direct time image. Plenty of movies have plot holes. Doesn't mean they have a pure time image or they waste time with CGI, but they still appeal to normal succession. What should be fixed and what should be unfixed in the threshold of the present in order to affirm a time image? Kane's death is too fixed for the other characters to find the key to his life in their pasts, which is already dead. Their sheets, their memories, Deleuze says, are sterile and suspicious. Well, suspicious past is a perfectly good time image, but maybe a different flashback starter with a less fixed present could simultanize past and present better, And Deleuze finds such experiments in Wells's films. So there's 6 pages on this, but I'm just going to say in a paragraph what Wells does in some of his other films with flashbacks. The magnificent Ambersons flashes back from several characters, not just one, so it has more pasts to explore, although less chance of using it. And in fact, it's specifically the unusability of the past that Deleuze has in mind when he says so famously that time is out of joint or in crisis, and that sheets of past float beyond recollection images in all directions. In The Lady from Shanghai, the sheets of past are more like hallucinations. In Mr. Arkadin, the title character assassinates everybody in his flashbacks. In Wells's film of The Trial, Kay seeks the sheet of past where he might have committed the crime he's accused of, sort of like seeking Rosebud. But at this point, Deleuze shifts to yet another model, another picture of what sheets of past are. What Deleuze now names as the sheets of past are not periods of Kay's life, but themes. Deleuze calls them regions of women, books, or religion. These sheets have no recollection character, but are simply what you could call juxtaposed presences. But this is what now Deleuze calls pure time. Pure time in the text becomes so pure that it's not really time. At least Deleuze's story about Wells's development is that the sheets of time in his films become more and more unhinged from both the present and the past. Now, on this theory of the past in general, as Deleuze calls it, it doesn't even sound right anymore to say that time is in crisis. Time is just an imminent, universal becoming, he says, with a non-chronological order. This is Hallward territory. Some of you know Hallward's interpretation of Deleuze is that Deleuze's ontology is entirely indifferent to the world. And it starts to sound like that here. It's a picture of becoming that's divorced from all worldly history. Deleuze says in this, near the end of the section, that we come from this primordial time of the earth, a universe of prehistory, the prehistory of consciousness at the birth of time, before there was any separation, when all coexistence is adjacent. And here Deleuze calls time a muddy, vital medium. Actually has the muddy sets of Wells's Macbeth in mind, so he's actually thinking of a concrete image. And yet Deleuze says there's no confusion in this. Non-chronological time is not incoherent. And Deleuze insists, as he always does, I'm not saying that everything is equivalent to everything else. Well, how can muddy time not be confused? If it threatens to reduce to indeterminacy what both the paradigm of flashbacks and the paradigm of depth of field had earlier treated as an assemblage of very specific sheets of past. Anyone who's tried to make a film knows there's a difference between confusion, which is easy to produce, and obscurity, which is hard. When merely confused, as in what Deleuze calls bad arty films, differences are juxtaposed incoherently, resulting merely in generalization. In contrast, differences can be serialized so that specific particles of one element are also particles of another. That's mud. That specific percepts are rendered by what overlays them. That's an image. And specific moments at one slice of the timeline are also moments at another slice, simultaneity and delay. That's the pure past time image, I think. In short, muddy but unconfused timelines could, in theory, retain their specificity, but we need to say more about how what he calls the whole earth of time could overlap in the editing. Deleuze's comment on mud ends the section on sheets of past. Eventually, in a later chapter, he's going to posit the brain to hold together the non-localizable relations between sheets of past as the brain is a kind of inner screen on which flashbacks and framing presents run at their own times and places, but in the same place as in the brain. I don't know how convincing that is. In any case, the challenge here is that the brain is not the same as consciousness. The brain, or we could say the editing program, may contain a time image, but not a conscious image of it. Let me just recapitulate the flow of ideas in the last couple of pages. Pure time has to unfix the present. That leads to mud. What the brain is full of. The brain cannot see itself. Therefore, time is an invisible image. This suits Bergson's thesis that pure memory is the retention of an event. It's a virtual persistence, but independent of whether the mind is conscious of it at a given moment. That's the right theory, I think. A pure memory is not something that we're always conscious of. It's the potential regaining of that experience. Pure memory for Bergson exists as the past. He even says that the memory exists in the past. Memory is not an experience that one could be having in the present. Once it's experienced in the present, the pure memory or the retained past is now transformed into a present recollection image. It's no longer a past. And so Deleuze says the extension of sheets of past exists outside of consciousness in time. The past exists in time, fair enough. The directness of the time image means precisely that it cannot be the content of any frame passing through the projector in a present moment. Or to say it differently, since, as we said, every event is repeatable as a past, memorable as a past at the same time as it passes through the present, we could say that the past is a secondary content of every frame. So what should a sheet of past look like? Perhaps it should just look the same as an action shot. It should look like John Wayne saving Jimmy Stewart's butt in Who Shot Liberty Valance. That's the film whose flashbacks are action images, if ever there was one. A sheet of past should look like any event as past, no matter what the gaffer is doing with the lights. In any case, the idea is that we see the past in the past. We go back to the past to see it. Past time is not represented in art. Art enters into the past. This is what Bergson would say, and Deleuze likes this idea. Maybe this is what Hegel meant by saying art is in the past. But still, how does cinema go to the past? Blank screens are too indeterminate. Memory twists are too determinate. The difficulty we keep running up against is that Deleuze has three different models of the direct time image, and each one does have some instances. One instance is the deterritorialized time sequence. The pure past, serialized and relayed throughout the duration of the film, is a time image, but maybe not exactly direct. Maybe more like what Deleuze sometimes calls indirect discourse, indirect vision, or the free indirect. The second model of the direct time image is the deep focus composition immediately present in a single shot. This is a direct image, but maybe it's not exactly time. And the third model of the pure past is thought. It's a past that's thought but not perceived at any time during a film. This is direct time, but maybe not exactly an image. Deleuze's approach is to manage one of these three models until it proves to be an obstacle, and then to flash back to one of the others. It's part of Deleuze's theory of time that there are different kinds of time, and each one has different functions and images. The time image as a resequencing is easiest to perceive. The time image as a concept, easiest to prove. But Deleuze still wants staggered time to somehow show itself somewhere in a single, even if complex and moving image, as a direct image, even if it's only indirectly visible. It should be as if everything happens at once, but the at once unfolds as we watch. Now, if we construe the end of Cinema 2 as Deleuze's solution to this problem, then the solution may lie in the fault line between the visual and audio content, which is the last main topic he deals with in the book, with the separate timelines given at the same time. The audio timeline, the visual timeline. Perhaps the optical and the audio will be each other's sheets of past in the depths of a single shot. So this is the last section now, radio. In L cuts, the audio of a shot in cinema is cut earlier or later than the visual. The meaning of the audio in a movie sometimes conflicts with the visual. Different tracks of audio, words, noise, and music can be staggered. For example, Kane's resonant whisper at the beginning of the movie, Rosebud, was made by overlaying two recordings of Wells's voice with different reverberation patterns. Deleuze cites the well-known influence of Wells's radio work on his cinema, although it's not likely Deleuze had much access to it. But I'll talk about that. The scripts for Wells's radio dramas in the 1930s for the Mercury Theatre of the Air or Campbell's Playhouse were not written precisely to the 1 hour time slots available. Has anybody heard any of the Orson Welles radio shows? Very good. You can get to most of them online. Since it was better for the script to be too short than too long, the performers would often run ahead of schedule and have to slow down to avoid an embarrassing gap at the end. If there was dead air at the end, the producer, John Houseman, would run upstairs to the CBS library and send random novels down to the soundstage for Welles to read aloud. Houseman and Howard Koch wrote the scripts in all-night restaurants, revising right up to the last minute. reading live on air without rehearsal, Wells might have to change his tone in mid-performance, along with the sound effects, which he improvised himself, when the plot went in a direction he didn't expect. As Hausman puts it, Wells wrestled with chaos and time. Now, an audio-only medium manipulates time without the interference of space and has its own speeds. As Hugo Munsterberg had said earlier about silent film, the rhythm of a play in silent film is marked by unnatural rapidity. Since the words are absent, which in life fill the gaps between the actions, the gestures and deeds in silent film can follow one another much more quickly. And ditto for radio speed, since radio edits out the visual, and so erases that redundancy. As we know, real life is highly redundant and excruciatingly slow. Wells is a master of the fast read and the dead stop, of lingering and throwaway lines, repetition, and the frequentative. In the War of the Worlds broadcast, some of you might know, audience members, do you know the War of the Worlds broadcast? Okay. The audience members believe that an awful lot of action happened in the real world during just a few minutes of airtime. The alien voyage, the army defeat, civilization collapsed, all in about half an hour. It's the slow-paced beginning of the show that made the increased pace later on seem faster by comparison. Hausman said, to spiral its action to a speed as wild and reckless as its base was solid. And meanwhile, at that time, radio listeners had been trained to accept the telescoped reality of dramatic time. And recent events in Europe had primed the audience for shocks. And the newscaster character in the War of the Worlds broadcast 1938 recreated the same timing as the reporter on the real newscast of 1937's Hindenburg disaster, who had taken a full second after the sound of the crash before telling radio listeners what had happened. So Wells used the audience memory of that real-world delay, and because the audience remembered it, it kind of accelerated the imagination of the second time around listeners. Many of the Mercury Theatre radio productions abridge long novels to a 50-minute format. One might expect a radio version of The Count of Monte Cristo or Treasure Island to run through the early scenes quickly to leave time for the adventure, but Wells lingers over the early scenes proportionally longer than the books do. When the action finally arrives, the characters, affects, and milieus have been established, and no explanations need to interrupt. The short but purified action at the end absorbs the past into a recency effect. In Citizen Kane, in contrast, the fast pacing is instead front-loaded while Kane is young. But in some ways, Citizen Kane's peaks and troughs do resemble radio serials. Serial episodes, against Aristotle, begin and end in climax, and that's partly to control station surfing for radio shows. Since Deleuze's sheets of past are less about speed than depth, though, the most relevant radio feature for us is deep focus sound. Audio cannot show a character walking away from the viewer. Audio can only convey it by lowering the volume on the person walking away from us. Wells uses this in the boarding house scene near the beginning. Young Kane in the background is heard, supposedly realistically, at a lower volume than his parents in the foreground. But dialogue levels are only partly determined by distance from the virtual viewer. Sound levels are also partly determined by how important the words are for the viewer to hear. In fact, the very notion of realism in deep focus sound leads to contradictions. The characters have to hear each other, and we have to hear them. So when characters rotate, remaining equidistant from each other, but one of them moving away from the camera eye or the microphone ear, should the character more distant from us get quieter or not? The audience hears the action both from the standpoint of the interlocutor and from the standpoint of the camera lens, so she hears the action from two contradictory perspectives at once. In deep focus photography, characters at visibly different distances from us are equally sharp, so they have both depth and distance. But if we hear the distant character as sharply as the near character, then we have deep focus sound, but we lose the distance. Indeed, as Rick Altman, who writes about sound in Citizen Kane, says, since volume varies proportionally to the inverse of the square of the distance, we might expect that the sound reaching the ears of the audience from a near foreground character would be much as 100 times or more louder than the sound of a background character. And in shot, reverse shot, where you see first one person speaking, then the other, back and forth, one character in the conversation would end up briefly sounding louder than the other, which makes no sense. Well, the solution developed for John Ford's How Green Was My Valley, made the same year as Citizen Kane, was basically to just avoid deep focus photography in any scene with dialogue. And that became a standard in Hollywood for decades. In short, contradictions between visual and audio produce a staggered temporal effect that's as fundamental as overlaid flashbacks. Adorno and Eisler wrote in the 1940s, Adorno wrote a book on film music with Eisler, that the eye in 20th century culture learned to see the world in a cubist manner faster than the ear learned to hear atonal music, so that the sense perceptions in our own heads function about a century apart from each other. And at least until this changes, the audio will always be the sheet of past for the visual. Now, all of these radio-inspired functions, abridgment, depth of sound, atonality, audio-visual disparity, could contribute to a theory of cinematic sheets of past. However, none of them is at play in Susan's suicide attempt scene. Although I've posed questions about Deleuze's use of this film, Citizen Kane is certainly about the problem of the survival of the past. If I were to give my own account of time in Citizen Kane, I'd start at least by rejecting the common view that the film is about what Kane loses as he ages, as if it were a premonition of Orson Welles' own so-called failed potential. As I see it, the break between young and old Kane occurs just after Susan's suicide attempt at her sickbed. So if we showed more, you would see this next. Susan tells Kane nobody wants to hear her sing. Kane says that's when you have to keep fighting. Susan says she can't, and Kane concedes finally that she doesn't have to. And thereafter, Kane too stops fighting. To my mind, the rest of the film is a bad dream. It never really happens. The thing about memory is, if you can flash back to young Kane once, you could do it again. You can still see youth under the makeup, and Citizen Kane is certainly much rewatched. In spite of what the character Leland says when he criticizes his one-time friend Kane, I find young Kane convincing, intense, active, sincere, witty, interested, and Wellsy. The old man Kane is somebody else that somebody else who's now old saw. Flashbacks may interpose one type of sheets of past, the layers of shadows may impose another kind of sheets of past, but for a character told only through memories, young Kane remains on a sheet of his own. The shadows show us the other time, and the otherness of time does not make Kane not young anymore, it makes him still be young. Not a month goes by when I don't think about that young man. I think that cinematic sheets of past are not a given, but a research problem. Further explorations of depth and time might consider, for example, the relation between 3D and futuricity, iPhone mini-screens and anytime, whenever showtimes, Instagrammatological images that are neither deep nor shallow, pixels of past, other research problems. It seems to me that the theory of the pure past must be right, based on extra-cinematic ontological arguments about time. I've raised a lot of small difficulties that might seem minor in relation to Deleuze's great idea, but philosophies need to work at the molecular level, so I've just taken him at his word with every sentence. And whatever else, we do have to decide who the sheets of past are images for, even if they exist. Sometimes it seems the pasts exist in the memories of the characters, or for viewers who identify with the characters. Or is it the filmmakers who apprehend sheets of past best? Or is it the film theorist who thinks sheets of past simply by remembering hundreds of films? Can the reader of Deleuze's book about film imagine sheets of past, even if he's only seen 500 of the 600 films that Deleuze cites? Can a theory of sheets of past in cinema show even someone who doesn't watch movies how to make time visible? Or are sheets of past literally in the past and not experienced by anyone who exists in the present? For that matter, while we're watching movies, perhaps we don't exist in the present ourselves. At times, Deleuze says that sheets of past are proper to cinema, available to the camera eye, but not to the human eye. But we still might be able to adjust our brains to them. So as a final exercise, let's just see if we can flash back into deep focus past right now. I'll give you a moment to do it. Try a present, past, present form. That is, interpose a past event directly into your present, then come right back. Anyone could do a present, present, past, present form, a lived memory in the present about the past, but never really leaving the present. But try a present, past, present, present form. go to the past for a minute while your body, the meat, as Cyberpunk calls it, remains here in the present? Or are you already in a present, past loop, unable to get back into the present? Or have you always been in a past crystal and you've never been up here with the rest of us? Okay, that's it.